Hey, this is Vu, and I wanted to take a look at some things people do wrong that really lose them a lot of rounds and games, but couldn't necessarily be put into their own individual videos. And I've been compiling these for a while. They're going to vary in how advanced they are, but hopefully you can find something here that improves you as a player, or you watch till the end just for fun. Before we go any further, I want to thank the sponsor for this video, Leadify. Leadify is an AI coach that allows you to improve faster by analyzing your Faceit or matchmaking games and giving you insight into your weaknesses as well as personalized training. Leadify has also implemented a team finder area on their website that will match you based on your skill level, schedule, and ambition, so you can find like-minded players outside of my YouTube comments. Whether you're beginner, intermediate, advanced, or you're a professional player watching my videos trying to be as good as me, Leadify is the app for you. It's also free to use, so give a click to the link in the description and head on over to leadify.com. So the first thing, and the one that's really bothered me for the longest, is just play the bomb, lol. Now this isn't terrible advice, but people actually really misuse this advice a lot and just tell their teammates to play the bomb, as in play the time, all the time. But the reality is there's two types of playing the bomb. There's playing the time and there's playing the bomb. Playing the bomb is slightly different than playing the time, which is what most people attribute playing the bomb to mean. So if we have a situation where the bomb is planted, and I'm a good YouTuber who is on the right side, the bomb's planted, but you just planted it, and you're in something like a 4v4 on the B site here. This is not a situation where you can play the time if your opponents are already rotated over. You know, they're going to have plenty of time to hit into the bomb site, and the time on the bomb isn't necessarily going to matter. Now, on the other hand, if you have the bomb planted here in something like a 2v2, and your opponents are deep on A site, like they're pushed up into A ramp, then by the time they get over to the bomb, the time will be ticked down far enough that you can play the time. And there's a difference between the two. When it comes to playing the bomb, what you're really doing is you're playing the pressure of the bomb to catch your opponents off guard. So for example, having a guy close here E-box is great, and then instead of having a guy hide van like you might if you were playing the time, you might have that player come van pillar. And what'll happen is this guy E-box is in a pretty decent angle. He doesn't need to get aggressive. He's got an advantage. He makes contact, and as soon as he makes contact, this guy van pillar can peek out and catch that guy on the side to play off of his teammates. So what you're doing is you're forcing your opponents through these choke points, and once they go through those choke points, then you catch them off guard. You don't allow them out of the choke points with the misconceived notion that you're playing the time, and then you give them better engagements because you're letting them closer to you when time might not necessarily be a factor. All right, so that was a nice little complicated tip. The next one's very simple. Buy armor on pistol rounds. Just buy it. Guys, just please, just buy armor on pistol rounds. Now, the next is another one that's really annoyed me for a while, and that's utility usage. And this is something, if I ever make You're Playing Inferno wrong, this will absolutely be on it. It's the attempt to be perfect with utility and throw far too much utility. And the problem I have with people is that they'll be somewhere like here, near top banana. They'll be on sandbags even. This is extreme, but I swear to you, I've seen it even at high elo. They'll be sitting right here and they'll go, guys, we should exec B. And then they back up, they come to this angle here, they throw however you smoke CT from here, and then they start running over. Well, what you've done is, you know, you've given your opponents a chance to actually adjust to your smoke coming over, because they can see that smoke as it gets thrown and they can respond by throwing their own smoke. They can throw a Molotov, whatever. A lot of the time, less utility is better. Now, both in that you want to throw utility that you can pop in off of more often than not. Unless your opponents have no utility and you know it, then you can throw a full coordinated exec. But on a lot of bomb sites, B on Inferno being the most obvious, because you can go from a spot like here, if they're not peeking, from they don't know you're here to almost on the bomb site so quickly, you're actually better done by to do something like have one player throw a God flash, which is this flash here, and have another player back here who just off of that God Flash, as the guy throws it, smoke CT, flash pops, and you're in. And although there's less utility thrown, this Opper is blinded by the God Flash, so he's back. And by the time he can recontest, you're already over here. And then maybe after he threw that flash, this guy comes over here and he throws the smoke for coffins. That would be kind of one of the optimal ways to do it, where he flashes then smokes, because you catch the players that are, you know, initially in those angles with the flash, and then when they want to recontest, you catch them with the smoke. It really does bother me that people are trying too hard to throw all the utility they have, and it's hurting you actually trying to win the round. It also hurts in that if you have 3 guys all throwing utility, but you have 4 people in a push, that doesn't really work either. You need several players pushing in, so everyone volunteering to throw their own piece of utility isn't that helpful either. Just have one of the entry fraggers, he can throw the smoke on his own and then come in, and if you need, you can also throw a molly like that and you're good to go. Now the next one is actually another thing that's very common in this exact position. It's jiggle peeking this angle, or really any angle where you're expecting an Opper to be holding. The reality when it comes to jiggle peeking is actually if you can see your opponent, so a jiggle peek like this, even with your knife out, if you can see your opponent, well, they can see you. And typically when people are jiggling, they're usually at worse angles than the person holding the angle. So more or less, if you're jiggle peeking, they can see more of you than you can see of them most of the time. Maybe because I need to lose weight. I don't know. What you need to be doing is jiggling like this, where you can't quite see them, but what they're going to see is they're going to see your elbow, they're going to see your shoulder, and they're going to shoot at you. Now, this doesn't necessarily help you get information as to whether a player is there, but if you combine it with like shooting, a lot of the time, if a player is there, what you're trying to do is you're trying to draw out their shot, and by doing a good jiggle, you will draw out their shot and you'll know they're there, and then you can go for, you know, a few jiggles. If they don't shoot, then you maybe peek out, and sometimes you can actually catch them by over peeking, right? And they're so tight on the corner waiting for that last jiggle, you really catch them with that over peek. But this is one way people mess up jiggle peeking. The other way they mess up jiggle peeking is by doing something like this, where you're trying to jiggle peek this angle, and instead of jiggle peeking like this, where you're peeking kind of into it and out of it, people will be sitting here peeking into it and then more into it, and then into it and more into it. And this is not a jiggle, but a ton of people do that, maybe just not really thinking about it. And this is, of course, not the greatest, not the greatest example. Maybe something like apartments, where people will be doing something like this, where they're, you know, out here peeking it, and then they're kind of like this, where they're never actually off of frame, right? Even here, they can see your shoulder from the other side, right? Now, if you're on CT side, one of the things people also do wrong is bad rotations. And a bad rotation is not a rotation. The thing about a rotation is that you rotate, you know, you pivot. Maybe your arch player goes over to B, your truck player goes over to arch, and your apartments player goes over to pit or truck in this idea, right? You're rotating all of your players throughout the map so that you're not having to move one player from one side to the other. But what really triggers me sometimes is there's some contact on B, and the apartments player goes, yep, time to rotate, and they rotate all the way around past the arch player to B. And then you have this really awkward situation where your arch player can now kind of no longer rotate. Your truck side player has to back up, cover apartments, so he's no longer playing truck, and you have this really messed up rotate, because it's not a rotate, it's a Wizard of Oz rotate. I don't know. They're just, you have one player that just takes it upon himself to move to the other side of the map. And of course, this isn't always possible. Sometimes your arch side player is just a freaking robot, and he is incapable of moving from his position. I understand that. But optimally, if you're trying to play the game well, you want to make sure your rotates are actually rotates, not I'm going to the other side of the map past my guy that should be rotating, you know? It's actually really obvious on 3-lane maps, because a 3-lane map like Cash, where you have an A, a B, and a mid that are really defined, your mid player is going to be notably closer and a much faster rotation to the other bomb site, but you need mid covered still. And so sometimes people will do something like they'll tell their B player to rotate to A instead of rotating off of middle. But instead, what you want is you want your mid player to rotate. Oftentimes, he has a better rotation path than the B player. For example, if he's already here, he can get to an angle like this, while a B player wouldn't really be able to get to that type of angle, right? So you have your mid player rotate potentially to a position that the B player can't rotate to, and then the B player comes over and checks middle, and that can even additionally support the play by having this B player, maybe he comes into an angle that someone wasn't previously holding, and so he can catch someone off guard that was otherwise going to try to timing the initial rotate. The next two I want to mention are simple economy fixes. And the first one is, if you think your opponents are going to have 5 AKs, please, for the love of God, don't buy head armor. And try not to overextend your purchases by being that guy that buys head armor in a kind of, suspect position where maybe they have 4 AKs and maybe 1 Galil, where you probably could get away with buying just body armor, and then you also buy a kit. I see this very often from players that are trying to improve. They go, you know what, I'm a team player. I'm going to make sure I get myself that kit. And I'm going to buy head armor too because I don't want to die to someone. And then they end up with no utility and they put themselves in a really weak position. The reality is you don't need 5 kits on your whole team. Usually just a couple is fine. And I'm going to be a stickler about this, but the reality is sometimes it is okay to go without a kit, because you don't need a kit every round, but pretty much every round you can find some use for utility. And sometimes you'll even be in spots where without that utility, you wouldn't have even been in a position to need the kit in the first place. So just make sure you're not spending too much money on things that you don't necessarily need and then losing out on utility or weaponry due to it unless it's important to do so. The other one though, that does actually bother me quite a bit, I watch a lot of demos where people don't upgrade their pistols. And look, sometimes you can't afford to upgrade your pistol. However, I want to say that in general, something like a P250 more than pays for itself. A P250 is probably going to pay back itself plus 1,000 on an eco on average, because you get 1 kill on a full bought up player. On T side, that's at least 3,700. On CT side, that's quite a bit as well, right? You're getting a ton out of it. Unless you truly cannot afford to buy a P250 because you're going for a specific buy in the following round, you should at least be buying a P250, if not more, because your opponents in pugs are really bad at dealing with pistols. They're going to give you a lot of opportunities. And just because you might be weak at actually getting those kills now doesn't mean you shouldn't be doing it, because if you never practice it, you're never going to get good at it, right? So if we go back into something side specific, I want to mention the way people think about strats, especially at lower levels, but even at mid and decent elo ranges, is typically completely ridiculous. The thing you want to understand when it comes to strats in pugs is that generally, if you're calling strats, you're taking people out of their element, and that's going to make them struggle. But also, you're probably not a good strat caller. I'm sorry to say. The actual key to winning, even in coordinated games, you don't see pro teams running a lot of strats from spawn. You see them running defaults, and that's very coordinated teams that understand how to throw really solid util for their teammates. And the reason for that is because doing something like sending 5 people banana at the beginning of the round is just a good way to get yourself lit up by nades. And this is the most obvious example of this idea, but this is true in a lot of different situations. There are not a ton of sites where you want to go straight into an exec. You want to draw out their utility early, you want to push them back, and then you want to try and go for an exec a little bit later. Banana is the most obvious because, well, it's just like there's 2 areas you can be, but for some reason people think going 5 banana into an instant B hit, but not a B rush. I tell you, we're not saying a B rush. No, this is a delayed, slow banana take into B hit. You can't really do that, and trying to convince your teammates to do that is not the way you want to be doing it. in general, games are won off of defaults. And that doesn't mean that you can't be the banana player. You take banana control and then you tell your team, guys, quickly come back. We're going to hit B. Totally fine. And sometimes having a setup where you tell your team, hey, we're going to, you guys wait outside banana. I'm going to take it and then we're going to hit it. Sometimes that's fine too. But don't be one of those guys that's trying to tell his team, hey, we should be running an exec off the beginning of the round every round. First of all, I disagree with that in Pug specifically. But second of all, it's just not the way you're supposed to play the game. And you know what else people think is a way to play the game but isn't actually true? Consistency. I just want to say, and I'll use this to point out, that consistency is a myth at lower levels. Basically, the reason people are lower level players is because they have flaws in their gameplay. That means they might do something like peek out on angles they shouldn't. They might be a little bit slow to shoot back. Most likely, they're not clearing every angle, and they're doing things that leave openings for their opponents to kill them. When you're at lower level, you always leave these openings. The thing is, not every opponent exploits these openings. And so when I see someone in Gold Nova that says, hey Vu, how do I become more consistent? Please understand that getting better is to some extent how you get more consistent. Now, there's more to it. Maybe you are going to be an inconsistent player when you grow up into the higher ranks at some point, right? Maybe you are just going to be inconsistent. Maybe that's true. But the reality is, I'd say most people that think they're inconsistent at lower levels aren't inconsistent. They're just bad, me included. Now, the final mistake I want to go over here before I go on the couple things that I think people aren't doing enough is giving away too much information. And this one might seem obvious because there are some obvious ways people give away too much information. They run all around the map, for one. They kind of, they jump when their teammates, for example, if I'm spamming right here and you're back here and you're thinking, well, I can make noise, but you jump, well, that lets them know a second player is there, which is information that might be relevant to your opponents, right? There's a lot of different ways that you don't want to give away information. And by the way, just walking everywhere isn't the solution. You need to figure out where your opponents can hear you from. But one of the ways people don't realize they give away information is by spamming smokes. This is something that people do kind of off of instinct, but especially as an opper, I would actually recommend you consider whether or not you should be spamming a smoke before you do it. If there's a smoke down here, you have one op on the map, and last round you were B, but this round you're A, maybe you don't want to let them know you're playing A. Maybe it's actually worth more to not spam the smoke and let them think the op could be anywhere than it is to spam the smoke and have like a 1 in 10 chance of actually getting a kill. The same thing goes for if you get flashed off an angle. Now, this is one where very often shooting is the way to do it. But it's not always the way to do it. Sometimes instead of shooting and backing up, if you get flashed off an angle or you see it coming and you just back up, it leaves you the opportunity to re-aggress without your opponents knowing for sure you're at that angle. And I'm using Arch here as the example, but it would be probably more reasonable at somewhere like Truck, where the op is a little bit less expected. So they're expecting a rifler, they flash the angle off, they don't see anyone, and the opper re-peeks. Well, if they knew it was an op, they would be playing a little bit differently because you had shot, right? So that's some information that's important to understand as well. But I mean, all of it is important. Don't give away information for free. Anyways, thanks for watching, and I hope this helped.